In the mansion lit by crystal chandeliers, where every detail reflected the wealth of an empire built on cold, calculating business dealings, there was also a heavy silence that no one dared break. Amidst invisible servants and indifferent gazes, she, the young chambermaid with a shy look and calloused hands, walked as if she didn't exist. Humiliated by her employer's every word, despised by every gesture, she was treated like dust on the marble floor she polished every day. But there was a secret hidden beneath those luxurious walls, the heart of the millionaire, the man with a hard-nosed approach to business, yet who silently softened every time he saw her pass. He never revealed it, but there was something about her that set her apart from all the wealthy women around him, a detail imperceptible to his arrogant wife's eyes, but impossible to erase from his heart. On that particular day, his wife's contempt surpassed limits. In front of important guests, her mistress laughed at her, mocked her simplicity, and reduced her to nothing as if she were a disposable piece. Everyone laughed except him. The millionaire kept his face impassive, but inside, something burned. The tension grew like a rope about to snap, and fate seemed to prepare a twist no one dared foresee. What no one knew was that the empathy he hid was not just pity, but a forbidden, suffocated love, which with each humiliation became more impossible to contain, and it would be precisely in a moment of silent pain that everything would change, revealing that even the coldest heart can burst into flames when least expected. In the immense mansion located on the outskirts of New York, where the wrought-iron gates opened only for luxury cars and distinguished guests, the routine followed a silent choreography that few dared break. Between marble corridors, rare paintings, and meticulously manicured gardens, the young maid walked almost invisibly, always with her head down, her steps measured, and her heart heavy with the knowledge that, in that universe, she was nothing more than a shadow. Her name was rarely uttered by her mistress, who preferred to call her simply the girl, or, when irritated, nobody. For the lady of the house, the maid's mere presence was uncomfortable, like a stain on a flawless silk dress, something that needed a daily reminder of her inferiority. And yet each morning she woke before the sun, crossed the cold streets, and entered the back of the mansion, as if entering a gilded prison. In the main room, where chandeliers hung like frozen stars, the millionaire always wore a serious expression, immersed in contracts and phone calls. He was a respected businessman, feared by his rivals, admired for his coolness and ability to multiply fortunes. To others he seemed unattainable, distant, almost untouchable. But there was something only the waitress noticed, a discreet gaze that, from time to time, rested on her. It wasn't pity, nor was it curiosity. It was as if he saw something no one else saw. And this detail, though imperceptible to the rest of the house, was what sustained her on the hardest days, when her boss's insults seemed to wound her soul more than any physical fatigue. In that house, every object shone like a symbol of power, but the atmosphere was cold, heavy, and filled with uncomfortable silences. The wife walked like an arrogant queen, surrounded by equally frivolous friends, always ready to laugh at the expense of those with less. And the maid, forced to serve coffee and collect crystal glasses, became a favorite target of subtle humiliations, always accompanied by suppressed laughter. There were nights when she cried alone in her small rented room, wondering how much longer she could bear the burden. But deep down something kept her going. Perhaps it was the hope that God had not forgotten her, or perhaps it was the silent strength she felt when she met, even for a moment, her master's firm gaze. Little did she know that this gaze hid secrets that would soon change not only her life, but the fate of that entire mansion. Mornings at the mansion always began with the same impeccable routine, but the weight of her mistress's words was like a constant cloud over the maid. One day, while setting the coffee table with the care of someone holding crystal, she heard the high-pitched sound of her voice echoing through the hall. "Faster, girl. You take too long to even set a plate on the table," she said with a disdainful smile, as if displaying her authority to her husband, who merely watched silently from behind his newspaper. The maid lowered her eyes, accustomed to swallowing insults, like someone swallowing poison every day, but the heat in her face betrayed the pain burning within. The millionaire raised his eyes for a moment, almost imperceptibly, as if to intervene, but quickly looked away, trapped between his arrogant wife and his own need to keep up appearances. The following days were marked by small acts of cruelty, which seemed rehearsed by the mistress. One afternoon, when important guests were arriving, she asked the maid to serve wine, but before she could finish, she criticized loudly, "Even in this you're clumsy. I don't know why I haven't sent you away yet." The guests laughed, complicit in the arrogance, while the young woman, trembling inside, held her ground to keep the tears from falling. The millionaire, though impassive, held the glass tighter than he should have, as if the tension in his hands was the only way to react. The maid noticed, but pretended not to notice. It was too dangerous to believe that someone so distant could be on her side. Another time, her employer decided to humiliate her even more cruelly. He ordered her to clean the living room floor again, even after hours of work, simply because there was a small, almost invisible mark on the marble. "If you're not even good enough to clean properly, what's the point of being here?" he taunted, crossing his arms in front of her, as if savoring every second of the humiliation. The maid knelt in silence and mopped again, her heart aching. In the cold reflection of the floor, she saw her own tired face, marked by the weight of her humiliations. And behind her, unnoticed by her employer, the millionaire watched silently, as if harboring a secret he couldn't yet reveal. These moments became more frequent, and the maid increasingly felt the weight of living in an environment that reminded her daily of her condition. However, what her employer didn't know was that, with each insult hurled, her husband's heart grew further from her. There was something about the young woman's quiet strength, the way she endured pain without losing her dignity, that stirred him in a way he couldn't control. His wife's cruelty, rather than cementing her dominance, only accelerated what seemed inevitable, a growing crack in the millionaire's wall of silence. In that mansion, where luxury was excessive, the truth began to reveal itself in small gestures, invisible to most. And without realizing it, the mistress was creating her own downfall by transforming each humiliation into an even more intense flame within the heart of the man she believed she possessed forever. The hours following the embarrassment brought a different silence, denser than the humiliation itself. In the kitchen, as the wall clock struck nearly midnight and the house finally settled down, she rinsed the last glasses with the care of someone trying to wash away the pain. That was when she noticed his shadow reflected in the steel of the refrigerator. He didn't come in to give orders, didn't ask questions. He stood there, at a respectful distance, holding his own weariness as if holding a truth too great. He noticed the redness on her fingers, punished by the cold water, and discreetly took a pair of new gloves from a cabinet, probably intended for a maintenance worker, leaving them on the counter, without saying anything. The gesture, so simple, lit a shy flame in her, not of easy hope but of recognition. For the first time that day, someone saw her. In the inner garden, there was a stone bench hidden among magnolias. One afternoon, a light rain seemed to suspend time, and after gathering up the patio cushions, she lingered a second longer than was appropriate, watching the water trickle down the steps. When she turned, he was on the porch, his shirt rolled up to his elbows, his gaze fixed on a distance that wasn't just the landscape. When their eyes met, there was no fright or visible guilt, only a silent agreement. Life in that house was screaming for something no label could contain. She lowered her eyes before turning away, but she took with her the certainty that the rain wasn't falling for nothing. There was also the night of the shattered glass. His employer, nervous about a phone call, had dropped a glass and left, leaving the shards and the accusation of carelessness. The maid knelt, gathering the pieces like someone piecing together a heart, when she felt his presence, and he bent down to help, ignoring the risk of cutting her. Up close, she noticed a faint scent of cologne mingling with the chilly night. He picked up a larger shard, held it up to the light, and for an instant his fingers almost touched hers. They didn't. They couldn't. The almost, however, vibrated in the air like a secret. In the library, where almost no one entered, a grand piano lay sleeping, covered by a sheet. One grey morning, while dusting the shelves, She lifted the cover and struck a key by mistake. The note rang clear and melancholy, and she recoiled, startled, ready to apologize. He, crossing the hallway, stopped at the door. He could have scolded her, but he walked to the piano and, without looking directly at her, played two notes that colored the room with an ancient longing. Then he covered the instrument and left. There was no smile, just a kind of permission, continue existing. At the end of a particularly difficult day, when the insults had been harsher than usual, she found a small thermos on the pantry table. Plain, hot coffee. Beside it, a napkin with 3 words. Rest when you can. There was no signature, but the quick, restrained stroke gave away the author. She drank in silence, her eyes burning, not just from fatigue. There was more dignity in that sip than in all the polite orders in the world. The house seemed to vibrate with this new frequency, imperceptible to those who lived by appearances, clear as a beacon to those who had already lost themselves. He began to appear in unlikely places, in the storage room where she counted sheets, in the laundry room where the steam drew clouds, in the hallway that led to the side garden. Always the same ritual, measured steps, measured breathing, eyes that said what the mouth couldn't. In one of these encounters, he held the heavy door for a second so she could pass through with a basket of clothes. The small gesture, in a place where no one held doors for anyone, gave her new courage to keep her head up at least until she reached the corner. The tension, however, wasn't just sweet. It carried the weight of the impossible. When, for example, his wife crossed the room and by chance found them both at the same tableau, she in an apron, he in a suit, the maid held her breath. He took 2 steps away, coldly as if returning to his mask, and commented on a meeting, a number, a contract. The young woman understood. The board required caution. The pain of seeing his face closed again was a cruel reminder that, in this game, every gesture had a price. But there was also an indomitable spark that persisted, the certainty that people don't cross paths for nothing. One Saturday morning, when the house was emptier, she went out to put food in the dish of a cat visiting the yard. The suspicious animal came over and rubbed against her leg. She smiled to herself, a rare gesture that almost never happened there. Looking up, she saw the millionaire on the other side of the glass, watching unhurriedly. He didn't enter, didn't call out. He simply nodded with a slight nod. It was as if to say, "This piece of kindness is yours. No one can take it away." The words, when they did appear, were few and precise, like the lines of a contract that admits no amendments. There was a day when the guest elevator jammed and she was trapped for a few seconds in the hall, her hands stained with cleaning product. He appeared out of nowhere, punched in the maintenance code known only to the family, and before the door opened, said in a low, firm tone, "You are not alone." There was no time for anything else. The door slid open, the house returned to silence, and everyone went their separate ways, as if nothing had happened, except that everything had already happened. After that, the young woman noticed that minor accidents stopped happening to her. The tasks her wife, scheduled at impossible times, were mysteriously reassigned by the housekeeper under new guidance. The night shift was shortened on colder days. Deliveries that required her to brave the rain were now assigned to someone else. No one explained, no documents were produced. But she knew where the order came from, and because she knew, she took extra care to ensure nothing was revealed, lest her gratitude turn into a denunciation. That luxurious house, which had always seemed to her like a machine for grinding silences, began to play a melody that only 2 could hear. The more the mistress sharpened her arrows, the more furtive glances took shape, as if life were building, piece by piece, a bridge over a forbidden abyss. And yet, even as her heart learned to beat again, a premonition grew. Something was approaching on the horizon, big enough to test everything that still had no name. Because destiny, when it senses a love trying to blossom on forbidden ground, rarely passes by in silence. That night, the mansion gleamed like a stage set for a cruel spectacle. Chandeliers blazed, staircases draped with red carpets, and live music echoed through the main hall. It was the lady of the house's birthday party, and every detail had been planned to impress the city's most influential guests. Imported cars parked in rows, expensive perfumes mingled with the aroma of champagne, and every loud laugh sounded like an assertion of power. Yet, amidst this luxurious setting, the maid moved, almost invisibly, balancing heavy trays and struggling not to trip amidst long dresses and arrogant looks. The mistress, dressed in a shimmering gown that reflected every flash of light, seemed to reign supreme. She glided among the guests with the confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable, issuing orders and venomous comments as if handing out souvenirs. It was in this context that the humiliation took shape. Noticing the maid serving glasses near the group of friends, the wife decided to make the young woman a public target. "Look, she even seems clumsy holding a tray," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, eliciting laughter from the group. The maid lowered her eyes, feeling the weight of shame burning her cheeks, but she stood her ground as she always did. The millionaire, close enough to hear, remained still, his face as still as a mask, but his hand, clenched into a fist, revealed the restrained rage. He knew his wife's cruelty, but in that instant, he realized the limits had been crossed. With each laugh that echoed, his heart broke silently, not only for the injustice but for the silent courage of that woman who endured without breaking. The scene continued, and the mistress, pleased with the audience's reaction, decided to go further. She deliberately spilled some wine on the floor and, looking directly at the maid, ordered, "Clean it up now, right here, in front of everyone." The room fell silent for a moment, as if even the music had faltered. The young woman, with trembling hands, knelt to comply, and the camera flashes captured the moment as if it were part of the show. The pain was not just in the act of cleaning, but in the weight of the public humiliation. She took a deep breath, trying not to cry, and in that red reflection of wine on the marble, she saw the portrait of her own life: servitude, silence, and contempt. The millionaire, for his part, was waging an internal battle. His eyes were fixed on the scene, and inside his patience was breaking. His world had always been calculated, full of business deals and appearances, but there, in front of everyone, he discovered that there were pains that not even money could ignore. He knew he couldn't intervene openly, not now, at the risk of destroying his reputation and further exposing the maid. But within him something definitive happened. The silent loyalty he had felt for his wife began to turn into contempt, while admiration for that woman's humble. Courage grew like an indomitable flame. When the maid finished cleaning, she stood with dignity, holding the tray again as if it were her armor against the world. No words came out of her mouth, but her eyes, tearful and steady, met his gaze for a second. And in that instant, without anyone else noticing, a secret pact was made. Not of words, but of destiny. The party continued, the lights shone, laughter filled the room again. But for the three, the arrogant wife, the silent husband, and the humiliated maid, nothing would ever be the same. The mistress believed she had won once again, reinforcing her dominance. But what he didn't know was that that night he had just planted the seed of his own downfall, because the heart she despised no longer belonged to him, and fate, with its implacable patience, was preparing the ground for a twist that would transform all the smiles at that party into bitter memories. The next morning, the mansion seemed recovered from the party, but she wasn't. She woke with her eyes burning, the memory of wine on the marble throbbing like an open wound. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room she rented in the suburbs, picked up an old pad, and wrote, in the shaky handwriting she reserved for difficult decisions, a short, honest, and unaccusatory resignation letter. "I appreciate the opportunity, but I have to go." She folded the sheet 3 times, put it in her coat pocket, and caught the bus before sunrise, her face pressed against the window, trying to convince herself that leaving was the only way to save what little remained of her dignity. The city passed in grey blurs, and each stop seemed to ask softly if she was sure. As she walked through the service gate, the scent of freshly brewed coffee embraced her like a comfort. She walked straight to the pantry, took a deep breath, and left the envelope on the counter, weighted down by a silver spoon, as if placing an anchor to keep fear from dragging everything down. The Housekeeper entered silently, noticed the paper and quickly slipped it into her apron. "I need you to organize the linen inventory today. Don't go to the parlor," she said simply, averting her eyes. There was something in her tone that wasn't an order. It was a concern. The day passed in a strange silence. Instead of serving false smiles, she stood among the shelves, counting fabrics with the precise method she had taught herself. Mid-morning, the housekeeper returned with a typed note. New. Schedule guidelines. Administration. Inside, subtle changes. Her night shifts had been reduced, her Sunday day off was regularized, and event duties would be transferred to another employee. No signatures, no names. She knew where the hand that adjusted the world without appearing came from, and the certainty that shot through her was as warm as it was dangerous. In the side hallway, where the light always reached tentatively, the millionaire appeared for a moment. He didn't say, "Don't go," didn't mention the letter that could never officially exist. He simply asked in a low tone that made her breathe easier, "Can you work in the warehouse today? It's important." She nodded. He kept his mask on, but the corners of his eyes betrayed relief. As he walked away, his shadow lingered a second longer on the wall, as if trying to protect her, even when he wasn't there. That afternoon, while labeling linens, she found a small box. Inside were a pair of soft insoles and a piece of paper with 3 words typed on them. "Take care of your feet." The short laugh that escaped her held no euphoria, but life. She tried on the insoles hidden between the sheets, and the old ache that spread from her soles to her back eased half a step. It was then that she realized how things were changing without warning. The cleaning supplies were up to date for the first time in months. The basement washing machine had been fixed, and the service elevator, which had a habit of getting stuck, worked. Without a hitch. Invisible interventions, all signed by his silence. As night fell, she walked to the side yard to breathe. The sprinklers had just watered the grass, and the smell of damp earth brought back memories that didn't hurt. She thought about leaving again. She thought about her body asking for rest, her mind asking for peace. She also thought about the way he'd held the door, the unsigned message, the respite he'd given her like breathing back into a drowning man. Somewhere between gratitude and fear, a decision was made. He wouldn't leave that day. Not out of cowardice, but because saying goodbye under the shadow of humiliation would be giving his boss the perfect gift. Staying, for now, was his silent way of saying no. Later, as he carried a package of towels upstairs, he passed his wife coming down the stairs, impeccably dressed, perfumed, her expression sharp. The mistress's gaze swept the young woman up and down, waiting for her to tremble, to fall, to apologize. None came. The waitress kept her stride steady, her chin set, and walked past her without feeling crushed inside. The mistress frowned, disconcerted by the evident lack of fear, and continued on, as if sensing a resistance she couldn't name. At the end of the day, the housekeeper called her into the pantry. On the table was an unmarked manila envelope. Inside, a new badge, access restricted to technical areas, away from the party rooms. "System update," the housekeeper said, trying to sound bureaucratic. The maid ran her fingers along the edge of the card and felt, without seeing, that this was another bridge built over the abyss. "Thank you," she said, and the word, so small, sounded like a promise. On the way out, she hesitated at the iron gate, staring down the dark street. She could have left that night, but she pocketed her badge, felt the insoles dull the pain, and decided to return the next day. This wasn't just about work anymore. It was a silent struggle for her own story. If she left now, she'd be a secondary character in her boss's narrative. By staying even for a while, I could rewrite lines with the invisible ink of dignity. On the other side of the house, in the office overlooking the trees, the millionaire remained standing, his hands resting on the cool wood of the desk. He wasn't looking at contracts or charts. He was looking at himself in the glass, trying to decipher at what point a lifetime of control had begun to bend to protect a name he didn't always dare speak. It wasn't heroism, he knew, it was justice. Justice that isn't announced in speeches, but that shifts scales, corrects paths, lightens burdens. He turned off the light last, as he always did, and for a moment the reflection of the trees on the glass seemed to lean silently in the same direction. On the afternoon the incident occurred, the sky seemed to weigh down on the mansion. Dark clouds gathered, and the air carried a strange electricity, as if nature itself sensed. Something was about to get out of control. The millionaire's wife, accustomed to having everything commanded, demanded that the maid carry a tea tray up to the bedroom, where she was meeting with two wealthy friends, busy mocking absent people. The young woman climbed the stairs slowly, balancing the fragile porcelain with steady hands, but inside she was trembling. Upon reaching the upper floor, she heard a muffled scream. She ran to the bedroom and found her mistress collapsed on the floor, eyes wide, one hand on her chest and gasping for breath. Her friends, panicked, screamed, not knowing what to do. Without a second thought, the maid dropped the tray on the sideboard and knelt beside her mistress. She began simple life-saving maneuvers she had learned in a community training course years ago. Her hands pressed steadily against the lady's chest, and with each movement her heart raced, not from fear, but from determination. Her trembling friends ran back and forth, lacking the courage to act. It was at that moment that the millionaire appeared, summoned by the screams, and stopped in the doorway. The scene before his eyes hit him like a blow. His wife, always arrogant, dependent on the life that was slipping away, and the maid, kneeling on the marble floor, sweating and praying softly between each compression, trying to snatch her mistress from the clutches of death. The minutes dragged by until the lady's breath returned in heavy sobs. The maid sighed in relief, holding her mistress's head carefully, as if holding a piece of glass about to shatter. The millionaire approached, knelt down too, and for a moment his eyes met hers. There were no words, but there was a profound recognition. It wasn't just kindness, it was courage. It was humanity. While his wife was rushed to the hospital by the medical team, the millionaire remained at the door, watching the young woman adjust her apron stained with sweat and tears. He said nothing, but within him, certainty was fixed like iron. This woman, so often humiliated, possessed a greatness that no fortune could buy. In the following days, as his mistress recovered, the story of the incident spread through the halls of the mansion. Some servants whispered that the young woman had saved their lady's life. Others said she was simply lucky to be in the right place. His mistress, still too proud to thank him, pretended not to remember the details. But the millionaire never forgot. He remembered every gesture, every whispered word in an attempt to keep his wife alive, and every firm look that conveyed compassion even after years of contempt. It was as if the maid had revealed a side of the world he hadn't known, the silent strength of those who suffer but don't harden. Late one night he went to the kitchen in search of silence. He found her washing the last of the dishes, her expression tired but serene. He paused in the doorway, observing in silence, until he said softly, "What you did today was something you won't forget." She looked up in surprise but didn't respond. She simply smiled shyly, and that smile, small as a flame in the darkness, shone brighter than all the lamps in the mansion. The millionaire returned to his office with his heart racing, and for the first time in years, he couldn't read a single line of his contracts. The incident not only saved his wife's life, but also exposed to everyone the truth no one wanted to admit. The woman who had been scorned, humiliated and reduced to nothing, was the only one in that house who possessed true nobility. And for the millionaire, this revelation would be impossible to forget, as he no longer regarded the maid as part of the scenery. He saw her as the flame that began to warm a heart, frozen by years of convention and silence. The days following the incident brought a new kind of silence, not the silence that weighs heavily, but the silence that listens. He began to appear in places where he had never lingered before, by the laundry room window, watching the smoke rising from the machines, in the narrow hallway leading to the side garden, where the magnolias still held their scent even in the late afternoon, in the pantry, when everyone had retired and the clock marked an hour when only courage works. There were no excuses for his presence, no questions about hers. There was, instead, a delicate thread that stretched between them, unyielding, as if each encounter were a rehearsal for something that could not be said. One evening he found her in the garden arranging the iron chairs. The yellow light from the porch reflected on her tired shoulders. "Do you like magnolias?" he asked, in a tone that wasn't that of a boss, but rather of a man trying to learn another language. She nodded. "I like things that endure in silence." He thought about answering, but instead he simply rested his hand on the back of a chair and stood there, beside her, sharing the same air. The answer, if it existed, was in her eyes. There was a slow, careful start to the conversation, like crossing a frozen lake over visible stones. She explained that she came from a family that knew more about overdue bills than birthdays, that the early morning buses were the lines along which her life was written, that she learned to cook by watching videos on her cell phone, always with headphones on so no one would interrupt her. He revealed less, but enough. The father who demanded results even in bored. Games, the first deal he closed in his early 20s, the large house that never truly sheltered him. When he said, "I learned not to ask for help," she replied, "I learned not to get in the way." They fell silent, and in the meantime, the magnolias did the work that words dared not do. At the office one late afternoon, she came in to drop off documents bound by the housekeeper. He had his back to her, staring at the city that stretched out like a lit-up chessboard. "Thank you for fixing the elevator," he said without turning. He didn't feign surprise. "Things that should work." She smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "Not always." He turned then, slowly, as if returning from a great distance. "What insists on working even when everything gets in the way is what's worth it." The sentence lingered between them, long, and she left before another could upset their balance. Small rituals were born. A napkin folded with a slightly turned corner meant rest. A mug placed to the left of the sink, not the right, warned, "Don't come upstairs today, the mood in the house is bad." A coverless book left by chance in the library, poems underlined in pencil, unsigned, kept her company during breaks. When she looked for the volume the next day, there was a bookmark planted there, where the verse spoke of a love that doesn't announce itself, only changes the air. One rainy afternoon, they were trapped for minutes on the same porch. The drops beat against the stone, the temperature dropped, and she rubbed her arms huddled in her thin apron. He took off his own coat and held it out hesitantly. She accepted it with an austere gesture, as if given more responsibility than warmth. The coat smelled of a world other than her own, and for a moment it seemed they both breathed the same life. When the rain stopped, she handed it back, folded. "Thank you." "Thank you," he replied, and the word sounded out of place, too beautiful in that routine setting. The older employees began to notice changes impossible to record. The housekeeper spoke more softly when addressing the young woman. The driver began waiting 2 minutes longer than agreed for street deliveries. The in-house florist sent a small bouquet of lavender to the pantry. By mistake. Good things, when they arrive like this, as mistakes that reveal intentions. But the big house has eyes. A friend of the wife caught a glimpse of the scene from the balcony and repeated with exaggeration and venom that the maid was warming herself in the owner's coat. The phrase passed through the halls like a shattered crystal glass. That same night, the wife returned from the hospital with an acidic vitality, and the first question she asked the housekeeper was not about the menu but about the habits of the staff. The housekeeper deflected, but the air was already marked. He felt the mood shift, like someone noticing the breeze shift before a storm. So did she, because certain silences roar. Still, they persisted in what little they had. A good night said with a second too much time, a piece of paper with a neatly written shopping list, which he kept as if it were a portrait, a nearly invisible care for the flowers in his office, which never wilted when she was the one changing the water. And though no amount of touching brought them closer, there was a closeness that was harder to hide, the way each became better in the other's sight. He said, "I" less and "we" more in meetings. She began, walking with her chin a millimeter higher. The night everyone went to bed, the lights in the main hallway went out at 11 o'clock sharp, as usual. But a lamp in the library insisted on staying on. She went in to turn it off and found a flat envelope on the table. Inside only a typed sentence, "Not everything worthy can be said." She put it in her pocket, feeling the fabric warm, and turned off the light. When she turned to leave, the reflection in the glass showed his silhouette in the doorway. He didn't come forward. Neither did she. Mutual recognition was enough, and they went their separate ways, like two notes that, separated, still form a chord. The next step, they both knew, would not be taken by them, but by fate, which cannot bear to see secrets grow on marble soil. And in the distance the house's rumblings could already be heard, awakening to suspicion, that kind of clarion call that summons masks and sharpens accusations. What they didn't yet know was that the same rumor that threatens also purifies, and that sometimes it is scandal that reveals the true nobles of a story. Suspicion began as a subtle spark, but soon ignited the mansion's corridors. The mistress, still weakened from her recent scare, returned with an energy that wasn't one of recovery but of venom. Her footsteps echoed across the marble floor like hammer blows, and each order carried a sharp tone, directed with surgical precision at the maid. She didn't need proof, just reasons to turn. Rumors into convenient certainties. A friend of hers, a known gossip, had whispered that the owner of the house looked at the girl too much, and that was enough to ignite a sickening jealousy disguised as sovereignty. On Monday morning, in front of occasional guests, the mistress blurted out, as if commenting on an irrelevant detail, "Some people forget their place." Her next glance swept across the room until it found the maid, who froze in the middle of setting the table. The millionaire. Noticed, frowned, but remained silent, a hostage to the social drama. However, his silence only fueled his wife's anger, who blamed his muteness. Humiliations became more open. The mistress would deliberately spill liquids to force the young woman to kneel on the floor in front of others. She complained about the cleanliness even when everything was sparkling, and one night in front of the housekeeper and 2 employees, she directly accused, "Do you think you can seduce my husband with your lowered eyes and feigned silence? Well, know that this is no place for women like you." The accusation sounded like a whip, and the room filled with an awkward silence, heavy as lead. The maid fought back tears with all her might, but her watery eyes betrayed her pain. The millionaire, seated at the table, couldn't hide his discomfort. He slammed his hand on the arm of the chair, a sharp crack echoing, and his mistress paused for a second. He didn't defend her, he couldn't in front of so many eyes, but his silent anger betrayed more than words. His wife noticed, and this detail poisoned her even more, for deep down, she knew that the more she tried to crush the maid, the more she lost control of her husband's heart. The cruelty reached a breaking point one afternoon, when the employer, while out with friends, left direct instructions for the young woman to scrub the entire terrace alone under the scorching sun. While the other maids took care of light tasks, the young woman dragged. Buckets and brushes, her skin burning, her body exhausted. The millionaire watched from the office window, his fists clenched, and in that moment he realized his wife had crossed the line of what was acceptable. He discreetly called the housekeeper and ordered someone to take over the task. But by the time they arrived to help her, the young woman was already trembling, her vision blurry, almost fainting. Still, she refused to abandon the task. Her employer, upon returning, smiled with satisfaction at the sight of her dejected face, as if contemplating a victory. But what she didn't realize was the invisible thread that had formed between the humiliations and her husband's heart. Each insult was a brick removed from the wall that separated them. Each cruel gesture was an involuntary confession of her own weakness. And, unbeknownst to her, her wife was digging the grave of what respect she still had left. That night, the millionaire entered the library and found the maid, organizing books. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a strange flame of resistance. He approached her and spoke softly, as if making a pact. "You don't deserve anything that happens here." She took a deep breath, not daring to answer, but in that moment she felt that the truth, even hidden, was alive. The mistress could spread venom, but dignity had already chosen which side to stand on. Fate, merciless to the arrogant, was just waiting for the right moment to exact its revenge. And what seemed like the height of humiliation was, in fact, setting the stage for the inevitable downfall of those who believed they were in control. The morning of the expulsion began like any other, but the air carried a strange weight, a silent anticipation of tragedy. The employer, dressed with calculated elegance, called all the employees into the main hall, something that rarely happened. The millionaire, still sleepy and serious-looking, watched from afar, unaware of the scene unfolding. The maid, in a simple apron, joined the group with her heart racing, unaware that the floor was about to give way beneath her feet. With a cold smile, the mistress held up a diamond bracelet before everyone. "It disappeared from my room yesterday, and mysteriously appeared in the pantry. Could anyone explain this miracle?" Silence cut through the air like a blade. Before another word could be spoken, she pointed the jewel at the young woman, as if delivering a verdict. "It was you. I always knew that besides being cheeky, you were also a thief." Shock flashed across the faces of those present. The maid froze, her body trembling, the words stuck in her throat. She tried to speak, but the mistress gave her no space. "Leave this house now, and don't you dare come back. The shame you brought cannot remain under this roof." The millionaire rose from his chair, his hand clenched on the wooden armrest, his eyes fixed on his wife with restrained fury, but the presence of witnesses and the weight of appearances held him back. The maid, noticing his gaze, lowered her eyes to keep from pleading. She would not cry in front of someone who wanted to destroy her. She took a deep breath, removed her apron, and placed it folded on the table. With firm steps, she crossed the room, the sound of her shoes echoing like farewell drums. As she passed the millionaire, she dared not look him in the eye, but the tension in the air was almost palpable. At the iron gate, the cold wind whipped her face. She held a small bag, the same one she had arrived with months earlier, but now it seemed to carry the full weight of the humiliations she had experienced. As she crossed the mansion's threshold, she felt her legs weaken, but she didn't allow the tears to fall until she was far enough away. Each step was a struggle against pain and injustice, but also an act of dignity. From the balcony, the millionaire watched in silence. His heart ached as he watched her leave, as if something essential had been ripped away from him. Inside, he was waging a war between the need to maintain his social disguise and the desperate desire to chase after her. He didn't run. He remained motionless, watching the scene that would burn in his memory like an open wound. His wife, satisfied, leaned against the railing, believing she had won, unaware that with that gesture she had signed her own sentence. The maid walked down the narrow street, mingling with the city's anonymous crowd. The wind blew hard, as if trying to erase the traces of what was left behind. Although humiliated, there was a flame of resistance in her chest that would not be extinguished. And in the millionaire's heart, trapped behind the glass walls, grew the certainty that he had lost far more than he could bear. That morning, the mansion returned to its usual silence, but a different silence, heavy, empty. And what seemed like a victory for the mistress was, in fact, the beginning of her downfall. For banishing innocence doesn't erase the truth. It only makes it even more visible to the eyes of those who can no longer ignore it. After her departure, the mansion felt colder than ever. The hallways no longer carried the sound of light footsteps blending into the silence, nor the subtle scent of lavender that used to accompany clean sheets. Everything seemed impeccable, organized by different hands, but life was lacking. The millionaire felt this every morning when he went down to breakfast and noticed that the juice glass was in the wrong position, that the tray hadn't been as carefully arranged, or that the napkin, mechanically folded, no longer conveyed the silent care it once had. These were tiny details, invisible to his wife's eyes, but which, to him, screamed the young woman's absence. In business, discipline remained, but his mind wandered to memories. During meetings, his concentration would slip when some gentle scent or simple gesture reminded him of her. He would see her on the streets, mistake strangers for her presence, and sometimes even wake in the middle of the night, certain he had heard her soft voice calling from afar. The weight of her absence grew like a shadow that followed him through every contract signed, every glass of wine raised at social dinners. His wife, blinded by her arrogance, interpreted his silence as common indifference, unable to perceive that his heart no longer belonged to her. There were nights when he would walk to the library, turn on a single light and stare at the empty table. He missed finding a discreetly arranged book, a mug left in the corner, tiny signs I'd previously ignored and now became unbearable memories. On one of these occasions, he opened the bottom drawer and found the note he'd kept secret. "Rest when you can." Touching the paper, his chest tightened as if time had gone back. There, alone, he admitted to himself something he'd never dared say. Her absence was the greatest failure of his life. The mistress, in turn, immersed herself more and more in social engagements, dinners and appearances at elite clubs. She displayed the recovered bracelet like a trophy, telling the story of the unmasked thief with pride. Her husband, listening from afar, felt nauseous but kept his face cool. The silent contempt grew like a chasm between them, a chasm she was unable to perceive. One night, upon returning from one of these parties, she commented, "It's amazing how much lighter the house has become without that bothersome presence." He simply watched her silently, and in that silence lay a sentence. Nothing between them would ever be the same again. In moments of loneliness, the millionaire began to drive alone, driving through unfamiliar streets just to feel the wind on his face. He searched, without admitting it to himself, for her figure mingling with the city's crowd. He even slowed down when he saw young people carrying simple bags, as if he might spot her again at any moment. But he always returned to the mansion empty, his heart even heavier. The maid's absence wasn't just physical, it was moral. She had become, without him realizing it, the silent conscience that reminded him of what was still human within him. And now, without her presence, life regained its artificial glow, but it no longer held any truth. The powerful man, surrounded by everything, discovered he possessed nothing that mattered. At the mansion, his mistress continued her routine of parties and indulgences, satisfied with the belief that she had won the battle. But her every laugh, every humiliation told as a joke, sounded like a hollow echo to him. And the more she boasted, the further he withdrew, silently building a barrier that not even she could break down. It was in this emptiness that he understood the depth of his loss. There was no easy way back, no substitute. His heart, which for years had served only contracts and appearances, now beat for something the whole world would call impossible. But inside him there was no longer any choice. The weeks stretched on in silence, but fate seemed determined to expose the truth. The millionaire, on one of his rare, solitary walks through the city centre, decided to stop at a discreet cafe, away from the stares that surrounded him. While waiting, he heard two women talking in low tones, but not enough to escape his ears, accustomed to picking up negotiations. The topic wasn't business or politics. It was about the maid who had been evicted from the mansion. Poor thing, she lost her job and they still say she owes money at the local market, all a lie invented by that arrogant madam. The grocer said it was the boss's own wife who spread the story. His heart stopped for a moment. He felt a wave of mixed anger and shame. The injustice hadn't ended with the expulsion. The mistress continued to tarnish the young woman's name, spreading slander to prevent her from finding work in any other respectable house. It was a cruel condemnation to silence, a sentence without judgment. He finished his coffee without touching it, left the payment, and left with firm steps, his mind already mapping out what needed to be done. In the following days, he began discreetly investigating. Using contacts that had previously served to secure million-dollar contracts, he now sought information about a young maid lost in the city's maze. He discovered where she lived, a simple room in a boarding house with peeling walls, where she shared the hallway and kitchen with other women living equally difficult lives. He also discovered that, because of the rumors, she had been rejected from 3 different jobs and survived on low-paying jobs, carrying bags in markets and washing clothes in humble homes. The millionaire didn't appear to her, didn't reveal himself. Instead, he began intervening silently, as he always did. He anonymously paid off the debt fabricated in his name, leaving receipts that cleared his reputation. He paid the room rent in advance without the boarding house owner revealing who the benefactor was. And one rainy morning, when the young woman opened the door and found a basket of fresh food and an unsigned note saying simply, "You are not alone." Her heart sank. She didn't know where that help came from, but deep inside she recognized a familiar presence, invisible but alive. Meanwhile, his wife continued with her parties and social gatherings, laughing at her own inventions. But the millionaire no longer bothered to hide his contempt. In meetings he avoided looking at her, and at night he spent long hours in his office, distant, involved in plans she didn't know about. His silence was now more eloquent than any direct confrontation. He wasn't just fed up with his wife's cruelty, he was already preparing the groundwork for something greater, exposing her deceit and restoring dignity to someone who should never have been trampled on. One morning, sitting in his office, he opened a folder containing documents, testimonies, and evidence proving that the theft charge had been fabricated. Security cameras clearly showed that the bracelet had never left his employer's room until she herself had placed it in the pantry. The millionaire took a deep breath, knowing the truth was in his hands. But he also knew it wasn't time to reveal it yet. Karma, relentless, likes to choose the exact moment to manifest itself. In his heart, however, one certainty was already firmly established. The young woman had not been defeated. The world had tried to erase her, but her dignity remained intact, and he now would be the invisible force that sustained her resistance until the turning point arrived. The truth began to leak through cracks where the boss never imagined air would be. The insurance company's routine request to review the jewelry security protocols, discreetly induced by him, forced the security chief to review the cameras on the private floor. Timestamps, door logs, the clear image of a gloved hand removing the bracelet from the safe, and hours later, the same hand depositing the piece inside a food box in the pantry. The footage didn't show the face, but it did show the bracelet before and after, and an unmistakable detail, the enormous ring that only his wife wore. The security chief carried the footage to the office, trembling. He watched it twice without uttering a single curse, and then simply said, "Thank you. File a copy. I'll take the rest." It was no longer anger. It was clarity. Around the same time, the rumor that the former employee owed money at the grocery store was dispelled when the owner of the neighborhood grocery store, pressured by a pro bono lawyer he'd recommended, signed a formal statement stating the debt had never existed. The letter, taken to the boarding house where the young woman lived, arrived along with an envelope containing proof of 3 months' rent payment and an unsigned card. "Your name is cleared." She wept. Silently, sitting on the edge of her bed, not for easy relief but for something rarer. The feeling that, despite everything, she hadn't been abandoned by the world. While the gears of truth were shifting, the mistress continued her act. She prepared an intimate lunch at the mansion for friends in Manhattan, displaying the bracelet again, this time as a trophy of her own perception. The invited jeweler, a renowned professional, excused himself to examine the piece under the light. Then he cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss, I'm sorry, but this bracelet hasn't been removed from the safe for any adjustments in the last 6 months. And the micro-engraving on the clasp indicates that it was opened here, in the house, a few days ago." The laughter at the table died down. The wife tried to turn the observation into praise for rigorous security, but 2 guests exchanged quick glances, calibrating the social distance they should maintain from then on. A fall from a pedestal doesn't begin with a tumble, it begins with an inch. He didn't celebrate. He adjusted his tie, left before dessert, and that same afternoon went to a simple cafe in Queens. He waited at a table near the window. When she entered, understated dress, hair tied back, her hands nervously unsure where to rest, his heart had to remember to beat. There were no hugs, no euphoria. There was respect. He held out a thin folder, copies of the camera footage, the market retraction, 2 letters of E, a recommendation signed by directors of partner hotels, and a printed note. "I apologize." The word, so rare in the mouth of a powerful man, took up the entire table. She read it all slowly. She didn't ask for money, didn't ask why he hadn't defended her sooner. She simply looked up and said, "I just needed my name back." He nodded as if receiving a fair order. He paid for the coffee but left in debt, to her and to himself. The mansion began to change its tone. The housekeeper, armed with old-fashioned courage, requested an operational meeting with her employers, and in front of 2 family lawyers mentioned inconsistencies in the accusations made against the former employee. The head of security presented the system report in cold, technical language. No one used the word guilty, no one needed to. The wife blushed beneath the impeccable foundation and, out of pride, tried to turn the tables. This is all a misunderstanding. The lawyer exhaled through his nose, rested his pen on the pad and wrote, "It is hereby recorded that from now on unsubstantiated accusations will not be repeated. Legal language is dry, but sometimes it tastes like justice." Outside, the city continued. Her reputation finally rehabilitated. She began working odd jobs at a midtown hotel, where the manager, after reading her letter of recommendation, simply said, "Here, dignity isn't a resume, it's culture. Welcome." And on Sundays, the young woman discreetly helped in the church's soup kitchen, serving women who carried in their eyes the same weariness that had once accompanied her at the mansion. No one filmed her, no one praised her, but 2 longtime employees, upon seeing her by chance at that job, returned to work with something new in their hearts. The big house, even without admitting it, already knew who the real lady was. The boss's social circle, alert to the smell of smoke, began to drift away. Invitations dwindled, messages went unanswered. The reservation for the most sought-after table at a restaurant was rearranged for another time. The humiliation she sowed returned patiently, with the same coldness she once wielded. The millionaire, in turn, scheduled a presentation at the library under the pretext of updating protocols. He gathered those present on the day of the accusation, projected graphs, talked about insurance, response times, and then, without raising his voice, displayed the seconds necessary for silence to do the rest. No one pointed it out. Karma doesn't shout, it illuminates. When the lights came on, the wife faced her husband with her usual haughtiness, but her eyes flickered for a moment. He ended the meeting with a simple warning. "In this house, no one leaves a smaller man than when they came." And as the people dispersed, the housekeeper murmured, more to herself than to anyone else, "So be it." That night, in the boarding-house room, the maid held the letter of recommendation between her fingers like a passport. It wasn't a return to the mansion he desired. It was the recapture of his own history. Even so, before turning out the light, he thought of the magnolia garden. Across the river, he remained on the porch, gazing at the same stars, with the clear feeling that truth had finally found its way. The final gesture was missing, not of spectacle but of meaning, the one that puts everything in its place and restores to what is worthy the right to exist in the light of day. Winter arrived early that year, and with it, the mansion took on an even heavier atmosphere, as if the walls held echoes of unspoken secrets. His wife walked with firm steps, but she no longer found the same reverence in the eyes of her servants. Invitations to the most exclusive events dwindled. Her former friends avoided lingering during her visits, and whispers about her exaggerated imagination followed her wherever she went. She, however, insisted on keeping her face high, believing that her fortune and her family name would still shield her from any shadow. The millionaire watched in silence, and each passing day confirmed what he already knew. His wife's empire of arrogance was crumbling, not by the hands of others, but by the weight of her own actions. Meanwhile, in a midtown hotel, the former maid was slowly rising. He didn't have luxury, but he did have respect. His co-workers valued his discipline, guests commented on his kindness, and the manager entrusted him with increasingly important tasks. At night, in the guest house's simple room, he wrote letters to his distant family recounting better days. And silently, he held in his heart memories of the mansion. Not the marble, not the chandeliers, but the glances he had shared with the man he had never imagined would win her heart. Fate, however, wasn't content to simply separate lives. It arranges encounters when least expected. It was during a charity ball, months later, that everything converged. The millionaire, invited as an honorary patron, arrived with his wife. She, wearing ostentatious jewelry, determined to prove she still reigned among the elite. But in the ballroom, among waiters, musicians, and assistants, the discreet figure of the former maid appeared, serving glasses. The world stopped for a moment. He saw her first and his heart raced. There were no words, only the shock of recognizing, amid the false glitter of high society, the only presence that seemed genuine. Her employer recognized her as well, and her face flushed. She tried to hide it with a mocking smile, but inside she was burning with rage. When she had the chance, she approached the young woman and whispered venomously, "Don't you get tired of groveling where you're not wanted?" But before she could continue, a guest intervened, innocent and cruel at the same time. "Ah, you're the one who saved that lady's life months ago, aren't you? I hear it was a close call." The comment spread through the group, and suddenly, instead of shame, the maid received looks of admiration. Her employer's venom had turned into an arrow against her. The millionaire remained silent, but within him was a whirlwind, and the final blow would come faster than anyone could have anticipated. At the height of the evening, a journalist present, curious about the inside stories of the elite, asked his wife directly about the bracelet rumors. The room fell silent. She tried to laugh, to downplay it, but the hesitation in her eyes and the obvious embarrassment were enough. The millionaire then raised his voice, not in fury but in clarity. "The security records are available for any questioning. In this house or any other, no one will be accused without proof. And if there was a victim here, it was the one who unjustly bore the burden of a lie." The message didn't need names. Everyone understood. The public humiliation was inevitable. The wife's face, once a symbol of power, contorted in silent despair. The social circle, implacable, turned its back on her. Right then and there, karma served its sentence, returning to her the same pain it had inflicted, only multiplied by the echo of the exposure. The maid, however, humbly lowered her eyes and continued her work, without boasting, without revenge. Her dignity spoke louder than any shout. That night the millionaire left the ball early. He discreetly sought her out backstage, where she was collecting glasses with the same serenity as always. He approached slowly, respectfully, and simply said, "You don't have to be here. There's a place beside me if you'll accept." She stared at him, her heart in conflict. She didn't respond immediately. She smiled slightly, as if knowing that life isn't resolved in a single instant. But within that smile was the promise of a new beginning. The outcome wasn't a fairy tale, but one of justice. The wife, isolated and discredited, had to deal with the emptiness she had sown. The maid, once humiliated, rose with dignity and hope. And the millionaire finally understood that his entire fortune was worthless compared to the silent greatness of a woman who had borne the weight of injustice without losing her heart. Then the wheel of fate turned. Those who despised were despised. Those who humiliated were humiliated, and those who suffered in silence were exalted, because karma never fails. It simply waits for the right moment to return to each person what they offered to the world. Winter had arrived like a frozen mirror of what life insisted on, showing each person reaps exactly what they sow. His wife, once a queen of appearances, now walked alone among the social shadows she herself had created. Invitations became scarce, false smiles disappeared, and her arrogant voice no longer resonated even within her own mansion. The silent millionaire didn't need to punish her with words. Time and karma did the work. The maid, in turn, rebuilt her life far from luxury, but surrounded by what no one could buy: respect, dignity, and hope. At the charity ball, when everyone's eyes turned to her not as a servant, but as the woman who had saved lives and resisted injustice, the wheel of fate was completed. Humiliation returned to its source, and exaltation reached the one who never ceased to be noble, even kneeling silently on the cold marble. The millionaire finally let his heart speak louder than convention, and in that moment he approached her. He offered not fortune, but recognition. He didn't promise castles, but extended his hand, as if to say, "You are the reason for everything that still makes sense." Thus the story ended not with fireworks, but with the silent justice that only life knows how to dispense. Those who humiliated were humiliated. Those who despised were despised. Those who endured with humility were raised to the heights they always deserved. Because karma never fails, it simply waits for the right moment to return to each person the weight or lightness of their actions. And if this story touched your heart, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and keep following, because there are still many stories of pain, love, and change waiting for you.